let's go ahead and get started with that. First, welcome everybody to our book celebration for preserving disability in the archival profession. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I'm running comms for Library Juice Press these days, and one of the more fun things that I get to do are these events. So I'm very excited to be here, very excited that all of our panelists could be here and that all of our attendees could be here. I'm just going to say just a couple of things about Library Juice Press, just for anybody who's not familiar. We publish books that examine theoretical and practical issues in librarianship from a critical perspective for an audience of professional librarians and students of library science. So we do a lot of books that I think people interested in this book will be interested in. So I encourage you to take a look. Library Juice Press is an imprint of Litwin Books, so you can find more at litwinbooks.com. We are also the proud publisher of 2 academic journals, including the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, which showcases innovative research that critiques current and prevailing paradigms in library and information studies, as well as the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship, which is an open peer-reviewed journal focusing on critical approaches to the field of digital librarianship. If you're looking to stay up to date on these fields, I do encourage you to take a look at these journals and submit all your wonderful work that I'm sure everybody is doing. Feel free to also find us on socials. We're on Blue Sky and Mastodon, Facebook, Instagram, and a couple of others, but these are our favorites. We have more celebrations coming up. We'll be talking about the new book, Solving Names, on February 18th. Music information literacy, we're going to have 2 events for that. And we're also going to have an event on building our own critiques, narratives, and practices by community college. Library workers of color coming up in March. So more information about this will be pushed out through all of our channels. So please do keep an eye out for these exciting events. And then finally, let me say that this is just part 1 of 2 parts for this. I know that you're going to love today. You're going to want to come back. We will have additional participating authors, more lovely conversations. So definitely mark your calendars for that. Join us for both. It is different content. It will be lovely. All of this, I do want to say, will be recorded and on our YouTube channel. We will advertise that broadly. That is everything I wanted to say, and I'm so eager to get out of the way and stop talking because I also want to hear about this. So Gracen, I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to invite you to run the show from here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for being such a support system and making these events happen. I'm really excited for one of 2 book launch events with Library Juice Press and hopefully one of many upcoming with many of our contributing authors. I guess I will start just with a land acknowledgement of where I am zooming in from today. I want to acknowledge the storytellers and caretakers of the land that I'm on the traditional territory of the Ginyangayaga, the traditional custodians of these lands and waters on Tijage, past, present, and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge the ways that we think about place, space, and land, and the direct connections between land and memory work, and the intentional destruction of cultures and cultural institutions and traditions that document, preserve, and circulate memories and knowledges, not only just libraries, museums, and archives, but also other ways that knowledge is kept and transmitted and passed down. So I encourage everyone here to think about your relationship to place, space, and land, and those inner entanglements to memory and memory work. So Lydia and I are going to kick things off by talking about the book overall. Then we will pass it over to a few of our contributing authors, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A, for a conversation amongst our authors, and we hope to hear from attendees as well. So I feel like I'm talking a lot, but But I guess Lydia and I decided to start by a short reading from our introduction, which is freely available on the book's Litwin site, because we wanted to start this event by thinking about the many histories and knowledges that really led to this book even being possible. So if you want to read along, I will be reading 2 pages, starting on page 5, and then Lydia will take it away to talk a little bit more about the process of the book. So this book emerges from many lineages of disability storytelling and critical approaches within library and information studies and elsewhere. From the histories of accessibility work in library spaces to the more recent work within archives, we're indebted to the many practitioners, thinkers, scholars, and community members who have laid the intellectual and practical foundations for this collection. While the description that follows is not an exhaustive representation of the work that has preceded us, we aim to show the ways that work on disability and accessibility in the archival profession has emerged from the collective work of others. We first and foremost are indebted to the work of disabled people, to the work disabled people do that is often considered outside of the archival profession. Disabled people have long documented ourselves in many ways, through performances, poetry, social media, and art, and other forms of storytelling, like Alice Wong's Disability Visibility Project. These practices of disabled making and documenting have shaped the ways we think about archiving, and have, for example, influenced much of the first author's research, inform our archival practices, as well as some of the chapters in this book. We acknowledge the ways disabled people preserve our own stories inside and outside of what might be considered the archival profession, shape lenses and approaches within archives, and also help us call into question the many barriers presented for disabled people to enter the archival field. When addressing the archival profession, we are confronted with a plethora of norms, specifically those that have historically solidified around whiteness and white supremacy. This book would not be possible if it weren't for the many archivists and librarians of colors and those working with and alongside them who have laid critical groundwork on critiquing, dismantling, changing, and reimagining such traditions in our fields, both in scholarship and practice. Many have identified the ways whiteness has catalyzed the materials that repositories hold in legacy systems and today, and have built frameworks for addressing racist materials and the descriptions thereof. Crucial to this conversation has been the ways that whiteness has shaped professions in LAS through the ways materials are created, valued, processed, and represented. Other important interventions have focused on workers of color and how whiteness has been normalized and thus invisibilized in the landscape of professional values, worker identities, workplace culture, and other facets of the LAS profession that take Western, Euro-American assumptions as standards for practice. This work has laid bare how LAS work is political in the ways we treat materials, workers, and LAS education. It highlights how addressing these systemic issues is not a simple task to avoid placing labor of addressing issues solely on the very people who are harmed by them. This book is informed and indebted to the foundations built by those cited above, as well as many organizing groups, which you can read more about in the introduction. And we also want to pay tribute to some early work specifically on disability and LAS, not only like LAS policies and work from folks from like ALA, but also the SAA Working Group on Accessibility in Archives and Records, and the SAA Accessibility and Disability section, which very much so directly led to the creation of this book. And we also want to honor and thank and remember Sarah White and her work that really was some very early scholarship and interventions at this intersection. And she recently passed away. So we do want to pay tribute to her and how her work really made possible this collection of works and our knowledge today. So I will pass it over to Lydia.
Thanks, Gracen. So as Gracen described, this book's origins were in the Society of American Archivists Accessibility and Disability section. This section was founded in 2021, and it has been very much an incubator and a catalyst for many archival scholars to get together and keep promoting accessibility and disability discourse in the archives profession. And we were so excited to collaborate together, Gracen and I, in working on this project. I've been very involved in building out the guidelines for accessible archives for people with disabilities. This is a standard through the Society of American Archivists, and I've been very involved in accessibility work, and Gracen has done incredible work with disability scholarship in archives. And so we wanted to acknowledge this critical moment in our profession of so many people talking about disability and accessibility and build out this book. And it was a long and organic process, is one way to put it, for everybody here who's been involved. Thank you so much for your patience and perseverance through this time. Looking back over the notes in our Google folder, we've been working on this book for the last 2.5 years. So it's been a long time coming, but it's been an amazing project to work on together, both with people that I'm familiar with in the section and people that I'm meeting through this project. It's been just a wonderful experience. So we held some initial brainstorming sessions with some of the authors to kind of do some collective visioning about what this book could be. And then we put together a call for proposals. And what we sought was to showcase the voices of disabled authors to talk about accessibility and disability in the archives profession. And we also wanted to showcase perspectives from both sides of the archival table, basically, from practicing archivists who are doing our craft as archivists, stewarding archival collections, and providing access to researchers and existing within the archival profession, and also for scholars of archives, experiencing the archives, experiencing the services, and for all places, we wanted to showcase how we are both shaping the profession and shaped by it, and shaped and connecting with our identities as disabled people, and redefining it too. And so this book has over 20 chapters, which has been a very ambitious project for both Gracen and myself as editors. And just to give a little bit of insight on our process, we used Airtable a lot for creating forms to gather the submissions and then tracking the progress. It was a lot like spinning multiple plates in the air, like it was dizzying and inspiring and overwhelming to go through this process. So it was a community effort throughout the entire process. So not only were the chapters peer-reviewed by other authors in this series, but also there were many volunteers who came forward who wanted to help out with the peer review process as well. So it was a community effort of everybody helping each other become the best that they could be with their submissions, which was also very inspiring. So that's just a couple remarks about how things started and how things went. And so I'm happy to pass it along.
Yeah, so today we're really excited to introduce some contributors to the book who are talking about, both sides of the reading room table, thinking about identity, experience of reclamation, and the complexity of how disabled people are represented in records, impacted by records, working with records, and talking about some really important themes that some of which address healing, identity, connecting with the past, and imagining otherwise. So we will toss it over to the authors now. We're excited to have Michael Marlatt, Jennifer McGillan, Hilary Stace, Alexandra Pucciarelli, and Zakiya Collier to talk. So I will pass it to Michael to start us off.
Sure thing. Also, guess just wanted to pay tribute to Sarah. I didn't know that Sarah had passed away. We had talked over the years about, shared experiences of seizures and whatnot. So, because I'll pay tribute to that. So thank you to Gracen and to Lydia and to Sophie and to all my co-panelists. I'm going to talk about my chapter. But don't those cause you seizures? Epilepsy activism through film archiving. It'll be kind of an informal overlook of the chapter. I'll use some quotes, kind of talk about my experiences a little bit. And like I said, some paraphrasing. Start with the chapter that starts the quote that starts the chapter. More work needs to be done addressing accessibility in the archival film profession. I'm thinking, for example, of you with your epilepsy, stumbling across material that may cause you to have a seizure. So this was a conversation I had with a friend of mine who works in the field of film archives as well. And they knew that I had epilepsy, and it was about a talk about more, disabled inclusion in film archives. But the thing I never told them was what my seizure triggers were. And I don't have photosensitive epilepsy. I don't have photosensitive seizures. And it's just kind of an assumption that was made about myself and films, right? And that's not the first time I've gotten this assumption of seizure triggers over the years. Before working in archives, I spent a number of years in film festivals. And, anytime someone would kind of learn if I had epilepsy, the questions that would come up would be like, can you work with films? How do films bother you? Like, oh, really? Can you work with films? Like, aren't those going to cause you seizures? Which, is not surprising because that's a commonly held stereotype regarding epilepsy and that films cause photosensitive seizures with, repeated light patterns. Photosensitive seizures are actually quite rare for people in the epilepsy community. It makes about 3 to 5%. So in the chapter, I kind of define my own seizures. I experienced tonic-clonic seizures, focal onset aware seizures, focal onset unaware seizures. I do not lose consciousness when I have a focal seizure. My tonic-clonic seizures only ever happen when I'm asleep. So that means while I'm not necessarily at a risk of having a tonic-clonic seizure at work, it still does impact things through chronic pain and some long-lasting kind of neurological effects as well. So the chapter, briefly outlines the history of the relationship between motion picture film and epilepsy, particularly in the earliest days of the medium. So thinking of things like medical films and slapstick comedy, and I don't really have time to get into the specific titles here, but if that comes up in the Q&A, I can talk a bit more about it. And while emotionally exhausting and even somewhat traumatic sometimes, there is something to be said about preserving these problematic histories, especially coming from the perspective of someone who experiences seizures and kind of experiences things from almost the patient perspective. I address gaps in the literature that relate to epilepsy in the film archive. Such context is important because it provides a framework for the current relationship between people with epilepsy and film preservation and film archives. Often epilepsy and film are kind of discussed in two ways. One is looking at on-screen representations and authentic representation of epilepsy and seizures in film, and the other is through the physical symptoms of photosensitive seizures and kind of more of a science outlook of what about flashing light patterns are causing tonic-clonic seizures, right? And then I follow it with how I see archiving as a form of activism from my own experiences working with the physical medium of film. And I include how I would kind of catalog some material that includes epilepsy. Like I said, I consider it a form of advocacy and activism. There's kind of a therapeutic and cathartic element of handling physical film that I really enjoy, right? It's something can be said about caring for a medium that kind of has a negative perspective of yourself in the history, and it's almost a way of reclaiming that history. Working primarily with film allows me to engage with these stereotypes head on. And, it provides the opportunity to include the perspective of someone with epilepsy and this idea of addressing, archival bias, which is, something we've been kind of talking about in the last few years. And then I just kind of conclude with a broad call for more representation for people with neurological disorders in the film archive. Very little has been written and presented that directly relates to film preservation, media preservation, and audiovisual preservation especially from the archivist perspective. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I don't want to take up too much time, but.
Thank you, Michael. Jennifer, do you want to present?
Yes. Okay. I'm going to share my screen here, or my presentation. Are you all seeing the presentation? Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. So wait, hold on. There we go. Okay. So my chapter was called The Intersection of Personal and Professional Bodies, Disability, Mutual Aid, COVID-19 in the Archives. And it was about, it really was about the intersection of personal and professional bodies, which was a kind of a throwaway line that I had somewhere deep in it, and one of the reviewers suggested I use it as a title, so I did, and I thought that was a very good idea. And it's mainly about when the whole self you're bringing to work is a little or a lot disabled. And my disabled identity evolved even as I was writing the chapters. I went from I am not crippled yet to I have to admit I am crippled now. And just the extended writing process, I very much felt like I was writing backwards and forwards in time and updating my footnotes as I was going. So I was, the first half of my chapter is kind of me talking about the act of developing a disabled identity, because I was using myself as an example of disability when explaining my department's disability-centered approach to post-lockdown operations, and to assert that disabled identity, I first had to accept that I had one. So I've had scoliosis for 30 plus years. I've had spinal surgery 3 times. And then I was just diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 1 week before the world shut down. So the way I put it was I was trying to determine the future of my department as well as the future of me within the profession. So centering disability professionally, what I was talking about here was, as a department, we were saying we are a community and we are also a disability community. All of the employees in this department have a reason to be extra careful. And so we had used that as a framework to explain why we were doing certain things. So we also were applying the principles of mutual aid, which were, as we define them, we keep each other safe. We won't ask anyone, the staff, to do anything that we, the faculty, won't do. And this, I realize this is very, very dramatic, but it felt like it at the time. if we go down, we go down together, and we go down fighting. That's basically it. We were prepared to be stubborn and to make ourselves unpopular to protect ourselves. What we were actually doing was wearing masks in public areas, regardless of vaccination status, from not really March, June 2020 to roughly January 2023. And I'm still masking. My colleagues are only masking intermittently, but I still am. And also enforcing social distancing and other similar measures. We actually found that one of the most unpopular or difficult things for our colleagues outside of our department to really grasp and to work around was that we locked our front doors for a while, and previously the doors had always been open. So locking the front doors, everybody was upset about that. And then that's kind of it. So I guess we'll save the questions for the Q&A. But so out of this. All right. But yeah, that's what my chapter was about, was that there we go. Was that I was, saying in order to, because I was also talking about how, because I am not an administrator, but I was a department head at the time, that I had some power within the structure to enforce these things, and how I was using that and as a disabled person to protect myself and to protect work colleagues that were working with me. So that's it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hilary, it's very early in the morning, so thank you for joining us.
Well, kia ora, and thank you very much for this opportunity. My name's Hilary Stace, and I'm from Te Whanganui Atala, also known as Wellington, the capital of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's now 5:30 on Tuesday morning. Just a note about my topic on the agenda. The Royal Commission of Inquiry was into abuse the Royal Commission of Inquiry was into abuse in state and faith-based care. In Aotearoa, on my copy, there's just a couple of words missing. Initially, it was only going to be about state care, i.e. public care, but survivors of faith-based abuse asked to be included, so it also covered churches, religious residential schools, foster care, cults, etc. The Royal Commission heard thousands of stories of all types of abuse and neglect in state and faith-based sites between 1950 and 1999. I am one of 3 authors of our chapter, and I have a background as a librarian, historian, and user of archives. The other authors are Dr. Martin Sullivan, who is a retired disabled academic, and Susan Martin, who has a non-speaking brother who was institutionalized when he was 3, before she was born, and who she only found more than 50 years later. She eventually located him and his missing records, but important information such as his birth date were recorded inaccurately. She is now writing her family story using the extensive files of her brother's institutionalized life. The Royal Commission found that long-term abuse of all types and neglect for all types of abuse and neglect for those in care, so-called care, was widespread and systemic, whether in hospitals, children's homes, juvenile detention, residential schools, hospitals, orphanages, foster care, hundreds of sites. Those institutionalized or put into care were mainly vulnerable children and young people at risk, often with physical impairments or conditions like intellectual disability, autism, and what we would now call neurodiversity. Many were from poorer families. For much of the last century, New Zealand had eugenic-based public policy, which required those considered, quote, unfit, defective, or disabled to be surveilled and segregated. Many families had members who were hidden away in various types of institutions, Some only came to light when the big institutions closed, and our last one only closed in 2006. Aotearoa was colonised by the British in the 19th century, when eugenics and ableism intersected with the colonisation and racism. The Indigenous Maori people were disproportionately affected by institutionalisation, so there are high rates of Maori affected. For many years, disability was considered hereditary and shameful, so families were encouraged to send their family member away where they would be, quote, with their own kind. They were hidden to such an extent that this history was largely invisible and unknown before the Royal Commission's report. The inquiry had legal capacity to acquire and copy records, but it revealed significant holes in our records collection and archiving. Many records caused pain and distress to survivors, the term the Royal Commission used for those who had experienced state and faith-based abuse and told their stories to the Commission. Some organisations had destroyed records. Many records told lies about the survivors, blaming them for incidents rather than the abusers, recording wrong diagnoses, and often dangerous medication and unconsented interventions, including ECT. The final report and an apology were delivered last year, but there's a lot of work to do yet. As part of the whole redress process, there is a consultation and work program specifically on records, and survivors are involved. Questions include, what is a care record? How and which records need to be kept? Who can use them? And what accessible formats are needed? How should records be governed? And who owns them? This is all good stuff, but since we wrote the chapter, there has been a change of government here. The Coalition's government's austerity program has led to many librarians and archivists losing their jobs. Digitisation of records at Archives New Zealand has stopped. Survivors are dying with their stories. I went to a funeral of a survivor friend on Saturday. There is an urgency to sort this out. There are still records uncollected and stories untold. And of course, we need more disabled archivists, curators, storytellers, researchers, anybody with lived experience of disability to be involved in the processes. Thank you, that's my summary.
Thank you so much, Hilary. Alexandra, do you want to speak to also disabled experiences of archive?
Yeah, totally. So on my progress, I would like to first just thank the large community of people who led me to this point. I want to thank Lydia and Gracen for compiling this book, as well as my peer reviewers, and a special thanks to James Lowry for his valuable feedback on several drafts of this chapter, and to my advisor, Maury Del Bello, and to the members of the Ottawa Ethnography Reading Group, Erin Mustard, Baz, and Ian Wood for their insights. This chapter sketches out the preliminary research for my Finding and Fearing Disease Archives project. Through autoethnographic methods, it seeks to identify and understand some of the pretensions in researching hereditary disease in the archive. Many complex and interlocking questions arise from such a project, questions about what it means to engage with and participate in the archive and other institutions that have sought to simultaneously scrutinize and erase sick people, what it means to seek evidence of disease while disabled and Jewish, given the history of the weaponization of the archive against us. While I cannot fully examine these questions within the limits of my chapter, I'm interested in beginning this encounter with family stories and with theory and with my own fears. As such, my chapter is not an exhaustive study of the phenomenon of historical health information, but a step into uncertainty. I come to this project as an archivist, and throughout I will be thinking about what my experiences suggest about archival practice. Within this chapter, I interrogate the medical and cultural panopticon, drawing from the work of Foucault. I argue that the medical institutions, like prisons, serve as sites of surveillance that discipline the sick, particularly those who are deemed as incurable or disruptive of societal norms. The movement of individuals between medical institutions, psychiatric hospitals, and prisons is a process of institutionalization, where the chronically ill, disabled are constantly managed rather than meaningfully cared for. I also use autoethnography as a method of inquiry. I use autoethnography to connect my personal experiences and my family's experiences with broader social and archival questions. Throughout this chapter and actually editing it, I grappled a lot with the discomfort of being an observer, about writing about family, about writing about myself, to really opening myself up to potential criticism. I construct the familial archival gaze, which reframes archival power through kinship. The archival gaze, which was first discussed by Anderson and Fuku in 2016, refers to the power imbalances between those who create and manage records and those who are recorded. I also expand on the familial gaze discussed by Marian Hirsch, which refers to how families construct identity through memories and documentation. I introduced the familial archival gaze as a concept that blends the two, proposing a more comprehensive approach to reading archival traces of illness and disability. Instead of treating records as clinical artifacts, the familial archival gaze rehumanizes the people within them by grounding them in relational memory. I also deal with the topic of biographical disruption and the erasure of disabled people. The article argues that the chapter argues that the biographical disruptions extend beyond an individual. It affects their family members and future generations, creating gaps and silences in archival records. These gaps and silences are not always a negative, I'd like to make clear. And institutionalization functions both a physical and an archival erasure, as disabled individuals become highly documented in medical systems but disappear from family and social narratives. And then I navigate the ethics of archival research on disability. I reflect on the archival. I acknowledge the power of the archivist as both an observer and a mediator, with the ability to shape how history remembers individuals, like my family member. My article calls for a culture of care in archival practice, where archivists recognize their responsibilities handling the records of marginalized communities. And then I also discuss my own experiences of living under the medical gaze and the performance of the expert patient. And finally, I call for a more ethical and relational approach to archives. Our traditional archival practices treat records as neutral or objective. I advocate for incorporating personal narratives and relational memory into archival work that restores dignity to those who have been institutionalized and erased. The concept of the familial archival gaze suggests that archives should consider emotional, social, and ethical dimensions when documenting illness and disability. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And our final presenter today, Zakiya, do you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you. So first I'll say thank you to both you, Gracen and Lydia, as well as Library Juice Press staff and anyone who contributed to making this possible. It's a special thank you again to Gracen and Lydia for being exemplars of accommodation and grace as this process was both delayed and discouraged by long COVID, and all of the other chronic illness things along the way. So this entire process has really been a beautiful and affirming one. So I'm gonna read and share my screen. And I'm going to read just because it's a bit of a provocation, and I feel like it's the best way to sort of get the point across. So my chapter is entitled Rehousing Archivists. Oh, let me rewind also. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, also known as Lenape-Hoking, or the land of the Lenape people. And now, Rehousing Archivists, Attending to a Livable Future for a Black Queer Disabled Memory Worker. It's in between late Sunday night and early Monday morning. I'm writing this chapter from the in between bouts of sudden pain, in between 3 odd-shaped pillows, in between many chronic fatigue-induced naps, in between the raised ends of my new adjustable base bed, in between calls arguing with my insurance company, in between my chart messages informing me of yet another delayed surgery, in between doctor's appointments, in between COVID infections, in between disappointments, in between slow movements, in between the tight grip of a back brace, in between denied medication coverage, in between visits with friends, in between feeling hot and cold, in between needing a massage and not being able to be touched, in between the pain on my left and my right, in between my ancestors and descendants, in between my AM and PM pills, in between sickness because I didn't take my medicine and sickness because I did, in between past deadlines, in between treatments, in between calls from family members, in between community bids for care, and in between life and death. This is my life as a Black, queer, and visibly disabled archivist. My life doesn't always look like other archivists or even other disabled archivists' lives. It may not even look like I'm disabled from the outside looking in. This is my life outside of, yet intertwined with my labor as an archivist. This describes the liminal spaces I often find myself in, but doesn't even include my work as an archivist, with and between community archives, students, artists, elders, researchers, families, colleagues. Despite all there is to manage and wrestle with, it is largely made possible by my community and my decision to untether my labor from archival institutions' traditional full-time employment. I made this career-altering choice with careful consideration of the difficulties of navigating untethered labor as a Black, queer, disabled woman, and it wasn't a decision made just based on a desire to work differently, or not because I just, quote, give a damn about my freedom, like really give a damn, and not just my freedom for my personal self, as Jared Drake writes, though this was a significant part of my thinking. The decision instead was largely a survival strategy, a recognition that laboring in traditional archival institutions was killing me by not affording me a full life, one that honors need, difference, mutability, collectivity, freedom, trust, pace, my being. I'm inspired and take note and strength from the reimagining of the realities of disability in Black women's speculative fiction, from Audre Lorde's powerful and vulnerable retelling of her experience with breast cancer, and by the ways that Black, queer, and disabled individuals and communities survive the unsurvivable every day. I see the present work as a gesture, a vehicle towards new possibilities of archival practices, a speculative archivy that affirms multiply marginalized and disabled bodies and offers a critique of the archival profession's orientation towards physical ability and physical presence. There are many models for this speculative work. Dispossessed peoples living in spaces of impossibility, and especially those at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, have always had to make a way out of no way and, quote, read, think, and imagine otherwise, end quote. Radically interrupt linear temporalities and dismantle the master's house with our ancestral or newly invented tools. As archivists and memory workers, we are uniquely attuned to the history and intricacies, its intricacies, inconsistencies, its variation, voices, its biases, its gaps, and its ephemerality. What if we instead attune to the present, to each other, to need, to context, to condition, to life in the ways we already practice with historical materials? Here I propose a reinterpretation of a term archivists are likely already familiar with, rehouse, which means to house again, to house elsewhere in order to improve physical or intellectual control. I recognize that rehousing in a discussion about disability does recall a violent history and present of the institutionalization of disabled, disaffected, mad, or otherwise unfit for society. If a container or archival box was inhabitable, mold, pests, leaning or folded folders, acid containing, any archivist would quickly recommend or implement rehousing the materials within to ensure their long-term preservation. For visibly and invisibly disabled archivists, the profession, the archives, the workplaces, the labor structure, the architecture, or even down to the damn seats are inhabitable, unsuitable, uncomfortable, and unable to contain their multitudes and meet their needs. Here, I reimagine the term rehousing and rejection of the violent removal of agency in the process of institutionalization. To rehouse here means seeking better conditions for disabled memory workers, excuse me. I urge us to shift to a person-centered approach in our labor, one in which we move with the same urgency to create livable conditions for archivists. Just like archival materials, rehousing archivists requires removing barriers to safety and comfort, preventing harm, providing needed support, paying attention, and forming coalitions. And these are some of the ways that I have done those things on the screen here. And then I just read that. Okay. I insist that we reimagine what it would mean to prioritize ourselves and each other as archivists, that we reject the notion that records are somehow more precious than our bodies, and more deserving of preservation than we are of self-preservation. If we treated ourselves like we treat the historical materials we process, what would that untangle, uncouple, and reveal? How can we labor to free ourselves and others while attending to the unique vulnerabilities, positionalities, and knowledges? What new ways of work would emerge if we place care, real care, of one another at the center? Let's rehouse ourselves. Find refuge in safety, recognition, and collectivity. Rehouse, describe, and process. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been really wonderful to hear summaries of your chapters. And I'm so excited to have our everybody here joined on this call. And so now's an opportunity for us to engage in dialogue together. So for all of the attendees, I don't think there's a way for you to unmute, but you should be able to use the Q&A functionality or just chat in general. And so we'd love to hear any questions you might have.
We also do invite the panelists, if you have questions for each other, you're welcome to chat. We're very excited about the cross talk in all of these ideas.
Well, as we're waiting for some questions to come in, Gracen and I have brainstormed a couple questions, and so I'll start with the first one. Many of you write about personal experiences. Can some of you speak to the process of writing with vulnerability and talking about your own experiences? Jennifer, I see you've unmuted, and then Alex.
Yeah, I did. I was gonna say I can. It was it was very weird, put it that way. Particularly because as my vulnerabilities were evolving, that I thought I had finished one section, and then I'm like, would go back and kind of reread it, and part of my brain is glossing over it because it's done, right? And then I was like, wait, no, it's not. This paragraph is no longer true. As I explain my truly idiosyncratic qualification for at what point I considered myself disabled, which was my ability to do a flip turn. So, and I mean, and the other thing with half of my chapter is the first half is discussing developing a disabled identity, which pretty much everyone who read it said, "Do we need this?" I'm like, yes. Yes, this is the point of all of this. I am forcing you to sit with me while I talk about my disability, because this is the thing that shaped the way I shaped our policy. Yes, you need to know. Yes, I have to talk about this in excruciating detail. So I guess that was interesting too, was that I had to continually sort of push for the right to assert my vulnerability. I'm like, I don't really want to talk about this either, but I have to. Um, and I need you to absorb it as a reader and as a sort of broadly speaking a colleague. That, I mean, I'm part of my sort of ultimate conclusion and premise is that the disability community is in the staff meeting with you, right? The disability community is not an amorphous externalized thing that we provide services to. The disability community is sitting next to you. If it isn't you, it's sitting next to you. And so we're here and we can hear you when you were talking about the disabled as a broad group. So it was, I mean, a lot of my chapter was sort of fueled by irritation, I guess, which is in some ways a weird place to write from when, I guess, when you're writing professional things, you're trying to be more journalistic almost. You're accustomed to keeping yourself out of the story, and to being very dry, I suppose. And and I'm writing, if we go down fighting, we go down together, or we go down together, we go down fighting, and I'm sort of laughing at myself at the same time, as it's so over the top and so dramatic and almost ridiculous. But I'm like, that's how we felt. That's what we were thinking. We were thinking, here comes the kaiju, and I mean that not in more of an action movie kind of way. That, like, that Pacific Rim was what it felt like. We were walking out into the waves every day, and we had to keep the big lumbering thing moving somehow. So that sort of heightened anxiety and cortisol and adrenaline rush, like, every single morning. And at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, how long are my hands going to work? Right? I can't open the door to offsite. I can't lift heavy, like, what am I going to do? But we have to keep the department going somehow. So yeah, all of that was part of it.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I see that Alex has their hands raised. Michael and Hilary, thanks for also raising your hand. Go ahead, Alex.
Sorry, I was still muted. Okay. So yeah, when I was writing my chapter, I rewrote it several times, and even with different drafts, I kept having to kind of negotiate what information I wanted to share. Because the information given in my chapter is not just mine, it's also like family members, and it was difficult, and it was, yeah, a lot of it was negotiating kind of that stuff. And then also accepting the fact that now that I teach, my students could read that and they could have this personal information about me, which was kind of anxiety provoking, because when I submitted this chapter originally, I was in an MLS program. So yeah, it was just kind of like balancing that. Now I'm very excited. Thanks.
I can go next. I'd almost consider it being post-vulnerable than vulnerable, just because coming to the book, I'd already published on my experiences before. I'd done some guest speaking already. And it was almost more like a community building exercise for me. So, because I knew there was going to be other chapters from other people's experiences. And yeah, like I said, I'd already kind of shared what epilepsy was like with me, working with film, some of the job barriers I'd had in the past, some of that problematic material that I'd come across, and the difficulties and emotional difficulties that came with engaging with that material. So yeah, actually, if anything, the process of writing it was, I didn't feel vulnerable while I was writing it. I just felt positive and excited about everything personally.
Go ahead.
I'm just, I consider myself an ally. I'm not coming from a lived experience perspective, although I have very many family members and know so many people with various impairments. But it's been an issue for me writing about disability as a non-disabled person. So that's been an issue, but I also feel that I can be some sort of facilitator to telling the stories and collecting stories. There's at the moment there's a lot of discussion about the word vulnerability in New Zealand, that disabled people don't like to be. You have that term vulnerability. I get told off if I use it. It's actually at risk. There's no inherent vulnerability, which I guess you're all having those, familiar with those arguments. But you have to recognise that there is a lot in this sort of work. You really have to approach it with a trauma-informed approach. And I just remember when Susan, who was my co-author and one of the main contributors to this chapter, she finally got her brother's records, which had taken her years, and it was a whole box. And she couldn't even bear to open it. They just sat in this box of records, big fat files of medication that her brother had had over 40 years. But he couldn't speak about it because he didn't use words. And the process of going through those and finding all those details of 40 years of her brother's life, when she mostly didn't know existed and then didn't know how to find him. The trauma, you must have a trauma-informed process, whatever part of the process you're in, is really my conclusion. And I just felt that I was so privileged to be able to participate and hear lots of stories in various different contexts and try and put somehow keep them for as our communal story. So that's my bit.
Thanks, Hilary. Zakiya?
Yeah, so I'll say that I would say like this is maybe the first time that I've like sort of spoken about my disability and living with chronic illnesses as it relates to work, even though anybody who's worked with me has certainly heard it, and friends and family have certainly heard it. But doing so publicly, I think it was difficult to kind of think about being vulnerable, but being vulnerable in a way where I'm not just like making a list of complaints, which are necessary in some contexts, but not wanting to do that, but wanting to say something generative and sort of being inspired by, like Black disabled writers before me, of sort of like the quote I had on the slide of Audre Lorde, of sort of, living and surviving with the pain, but also using that pain and giving name to it and sharing it with other people, so that we can find ways to sort of live better as we all deal with sort of different experiences with pain and disability. And I think also to call on like another writer that sort of inspired me is thinking about the poet and playwright and performer Ntozake Shange, who talks about being a primary source rather than a reference. And so wanting to not just sort of to sort of have my opportunity to say exactly like what I think and experience, and may change my mind about things later, but in the present moment, just like being the primary source of my experiences with being a disabled archivist.
Great, thank you all. So there's a question that came in through the Q&A, and so I want to summarize some of it, and then I'll pass along the second aspect of the question. So,
I'm happy to read it, Lydia, in full.
oh, okay, all right, sure. So this person wrote, I am Black, trans, and have been masking neurodivergently less and less at my job, all cis, white, and non-masking regarding COVID. On a broader note, I'm isolated from the Black information science community due to super spreader events and little to zero discussion about keeping memory workers safe by normalizing more COVID protocols. I'm worried that my continued non-conforming unmasking and then it kind of trails away there, but then they say, I'm worried my continued non-conformity and being the only masked person will continue to isolate me from invaluable networking with peers and potential mentors. Do you have any suggestions for finding community that does a better job centering disabled memory workers? It's a big question. Anyone want to jump in? Alex.
So I've noticed it's a lot of trial and error. I went to a conference last week where we were all required to wear masks. It was a very small conference. Care kept being brought up over and over again. It was not a disability conference, but like they were very into making it so that everybody could attend safely, that they could feel like they belonged. Like it was just a really kind of amazing experience. But yeah, it's so much trial and error. Like, yeah, I'm the co-chair of a working group for the Memory Studies Association. I will get it right. And we just, as a group, have decided that it's very important to us when people come to our meetings, when they're in person or they come to our panels, they should mask. We do not want our events to make people ill. We want people to feel like they belong. Yeah, but it's hard. It's really, really hard. Like to feel like you don't belong in a space where you really, quote unquote, should belong. So yeah. Yeah. Also, though, like when I see people who are wearing masks at conferences or other events, I'm like, oh, those are my people. I should talk to those people. Those people like believe the same thing I believe. They believe that the COVID pandemic is ongoing and yeah, that we should wear masks to protect ourselves and to protect each other. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Zakiya.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, which I'm sure you're already doing, but just please feel emboldened to call out, what your needs are before some of these events and be as specific as possible of what would make you feel safe in that space. And I hope that people will accommodate as best as they can. And yeah, I think that people can think more creatively about how to, bring in box filters or, create these things together, which are also forms of community building, and people can bring in air purifiers from home and things of that nature, or sort of so just, hoping that people can do better. But also to speak specifically to you speaking about sort of feeling isolated from Black information spaces. I do facilitate a virtual Black memory workers group of like 250 plus people. So I will happily put that information in the chat for you so that you can join us in digital space. And should we have an in-person event at some point, you can trust and believe that that all COVID precautions, COVID and other precautions will be in place.
One resource I was going to bring up is Melissa Nelson's Black Memory Collective. I'm not sure if Melissa does, if a lot of that is done virtually or not, but that was just kind of one resource that came to my mind. For some of the work that I do, I annoy a lot of archival professional organizations because I'm constantly pushing on them for hybrid events to a point where I've annoyed a few people, but I don't care because that's the work that I do. Just because from like my own experience, I have my wife is severely immunocompromised, so being part of the community, not just for keeping myself healthy, but for her as well. So there's a lot of things that we need to be doing collectively as well, like when we're designing conferences or making them hybrid, when we're sharing all this information, we're making it as open as possible, just because there was this time during COVID when everyone, where hybrid conferences were becoming more popular, and then everyone in this post-COVID world is saying, oh, we don't need those anymore, when I know a lot of people who were able to share their experiences for the first time, be part of the conversation, and now that's starting to get taken away from them. So that's something that is on all of us to be doing, and we're not doing it. Or a lot of archival freshman organizations are not doing it.
Jennifer, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that to echo, look for the other masked people. Those are your people. And something I think about whenever I feel sort of uncomfortable or out of place or whatever is that the mask is the same as my cane. It enables me to participate. And if they're gonna, would they give me a hard time about the cane? Probably not. And if they do give me a hard time about the mask, I may very well say, would you give me a hard time about the cane? And also, again, I'm in a very different place in, as being white, cisgendered, but the mask is my act of protest, right? You ain't gonna forget. I'm gonna sit here in front of you in this mask. We're here. We are with you, right? You can't ignore us. So that's how I think of it. I hope maybe that might be helpful. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, so our chat is open if folks want to put other questions or comments in the chat or resources. But if you want to ask a question, I believe you can ask them anonymously in the Q&A. You're welcome to submit either way. I guess I have a question for all of the panelists. So a lot of your chapters imagine archives and archival work otherwise, whether that's like through a critique or a theoretical or practical intervention, through activism and advocacy, through thinking about what might not even be possible or different limits. So I was wondering if any one of you want to speak a little bit about change making in archives and thinking about the future of archival work by and for disabled people. I think, Michael, I saw your hand first, maybe.
Well, the one thing that kind of comes to my mind there is academic gatekeeping. This idea of entering the field and needing to have a master's degree and having to pay so much money in tuition, and when there's all these barriers in education to begin with. So looking at ways for community involvement and ways to get into the field where you don't have to be doing that. And then also, looking at our time in education and looking at where there may be barriers to accessibility. I mean, that's kind of what my whole dissertation was on. And even thinking about ways of involvement that can stray away from heavy theory and academic jargon and complicated language for the ability for the wider amount of participation. Said I think at my defense, I was too anti-theory for my committee, but I am someone who is I'm thinking about this need for involvement in a way that we're not cutting off opportunities just because we're using this heavy academic jargon, right?
Yeah, Hilary.
I think, as a result of this Royal Commission we had, which revealed so many problems with record keeping, it was one of the issues that came up again and again and again. So the report actually told the government basically to urgently look at the rules around keeping care records. So as I mentioned, there's currently this very extensive survey and consultation going on, which finishes this week. And they've tried to, they've sent the survey out in all sorts of formats, in plain language and Braille, sign language, all the usual things. But it's a very, very detailed, there's 18 quite complex questions that they're asking, and yet not any of them address the issue of staffing. It's all about disposal and rules and rewriting acts and things like that, which are useful, but they don't mention at all how to get more people into the process. And meantime, alongside this, we've got this austerity government, a right-wing government that is firing public servants all over the place, and so our archives has stopped all their digitisation programs, which is against all the things that came out of the Royal Commission, because we need more records, more keeping, more going and finding and keeping and making accessible, and we're doing the government is doing the opposite. And our Alexandra Turnbull Library, which is our keeper of non-official records like NGO records, they are no longer taking anything new. So on one hand, you've got people wanting, an agency, a government agency, trying to get better information about what is required, yet not addressing workforce, in the meantime cutting workforces and cutting capacity. So I think, even though we've got this really good intentions, it's not turning into something that will have long-term consequences for disabled people, as far as I can tell. You have to remain hopeful, but it's very frustrating that it is possibly a completely wasted opportunity. I don't want to be negative about it. Always these things are cyclic. At the moment, it looks negative. It could improve in the future when we have all this, at least have the data. But to get more disabled people into the system is another whole issue that hasn't even been tackled.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A kind of along those lines too. As legislation continues to shift more into censorship of marginalized voices, what sort of challenges do you see on the horizon for disabled archivists? Go for it, Michael.
Well, I can already see that it's had an impact on my income. I won't go into too much details. I'm based in Canada, but I do a lot of work internationally. And I had an accessibility related project that was set to start with a major institution in the United States that might be canceled at this point because of the current government. So that's already had an impact on not just my income in terms of archives, but also working on documents and strategies to create more accessible archives for everybody. So it's not looking great, and it's already starting. But I guess remembering to keep community in mind is important, not to feel isolated, to have conversations like this, books like this, conferences, and just community archives, just everything we can do to kind of band together is what I can say. But yeah, no, we're already starting to feel it.
Yeah, Alex, I think we're up next. You're muted. Sorry, Alex, you're still muted.
Okay. How do I keep muting myself? Okay, I think I've got it this time. More and more labor will be put on archivists. I think there will be less and less space for disabled archivists, which is really angering and really sad. And even like systems that have started to move away from job postings that are pretty discriminatory, like that for this archivist job, you have to be able to lift 50 pounds, which is a way of saying, if you're physically disabled, this is not a space for you. You don't belong here. Even if like technically they do have to meet your rights as an employee, it just makes people feel like they can't even apply. And I think, like, yeah, those of us who are still in institutions have to do the work to like try to change things in small ways as possible. We have to be cyborgs within the machine and change things in small ways. I hate to say it's going to be a lot of waiting. And I think it's going to be a lot of pain, but I do think there's a step forward. I don't know. It's really hard to think of the future at this point in the United States, but yeah.
Yes, Zakiya.
Yeah, I think it's both useful to both like speculate on, potential rights rollback, but I think it's equally as important to speculate on what types of coalitions and conversations and changes that those rollbacks will provoke, and sort of encourage disabled archivists to work together, and out of silos. All of the folks that are here today are more than enough people to invoke, small and big change. And so I think that, there will certainly be changes to policies institutionally, nationally, internationally, that will affect people, make lives harder, make it more difficult to do the work that some of us love. I'm not going to presume that everybody loves the work that they're doing every day, or the institution that they work at. But yeah, it's going to make things harder, both in institutions as well as in the medical system, which is hard enough as is, especially here in the States. And so I think that it's important for us to like start forming networks preemptively, and to echo the folks before me, like continue to be in community with people who have already demonstrated that they are, caring people and willing to show up and support not just you, but everyone else, and willing to mask when it's uncomfortable and when their face is sweaty and breaking out and all of those things that happen when you try to take care of yourself and other people. But yeah, I think it's more important to speculate on, our responses to the things that could happen, and like mapping out all the bad things, worst case scenario, and then what are we going to do about it, if and when that time comes. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question in the Q&A. Disabled Digital Archivist and Union Organizer here. Thank you all for this wonderful work. Building on Gracen's question about making change, what advice do you have for organizing collective actions as disabled archival workers and communities of records? For instance, building strategies that move at the pace of collective members' disabilities to make change. Yeah, Jennifer.
Okay, so this is something that I've sort of pondered. And it may not be possible to do this, but I think that if you can decrease friction and barriers to participation by building in a lot of it on the back end. So if you are putting together something and you want to have snacks, right? Finding out as people are registering, as they're signing up, as they're doing whatever, making it possible for them to specify what restrictions or whatever that they have. And then when they get there, they don't have to wonder, first of all. And nobody has to feel like they're making some sort of big ask for something. Am I making any sense? And to sort of build in all of these questions, like if you're going to have speakers, ask them, do you need a ramp? Do you need what are all these things that you need? Or finding some way that they say all of these things are available, please check a box to say, yes, I need this. Because I've been invited to speak at things, not in a disability context. I was actually a genealogy presentation, and I got there and they were like, oh, do you need an accommodation? And I'm like, yes. And I, partially this is on me for having not mentioned the fact that I cannot, climb weird foot-high stairs to get on stage. But also, organizer, how about you think to yourself, I should ask my speakers, do you need any accommodations? Right? What do you need to be able to get on this stage safely and comfortably? And also having done a little, for events even within this library, is having people who have dietary restrictions who don't feel like they can ask because asking makes them a problem. It puts target on them on some way. And I'm like, well, I don't care. I'll just ask them. I'm perfectly happy to ask the person putting this together to say, hey, do you have any gluten-free possibilities here? Right? Am I gluten-free? No. Do I want everyone at this event to be able to eat? Yes. Right? So I guess thinking about disability on a multi-level, multifaceted thing. It's not just about being able to get on the stage. It's also about being able to eat. It's about being able to go to the bathroom safely and not have to make a giant production out of it, right? No one wants to have to be make a production of very basic things. So I guess don't plan rallies or meetings or whatever in places that don't have disabled access. Sometimes it's really the obvious things. Have different disabled members do a walkthrough of a space and identify for you the problems that they would have in being in this space. And if they can't even get in the door, that's your first problem. So those would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Zakiya.
Just want to lift up everything that Jennifer just shared. And I think to add to that, I think just being really exhaustive in your thoughtfulness of again, worst case scenario, what are all the possible, every single part of every decision that is made, there should be some sort of corresponding, what is access related to this thing, whether it's the technology that's used, whether it's the time of the actual conversation, the lighting, the size of the door. With every single part of the day, there has to be something that is thought about, and that can feel exhausting, which is why it shouldn't be done by just one person, and especially not just one disabled person having to think about their own needs and the needs of other disabled people, but multiple people sort of being a part of that decision making, and having space for people to kind of, check off from an exhaustive list of these are the things that I need or that need to be thought about. And I know for myself, when I participate in things, I usually create that exhaustive list in my head of what did they think about this, or what about this, or it's cold in here, or and in addition to that, providing information to people about, you know, the space and place that they'll be in ahead of time, and like all the things they're encountered. Like, information is also accessibility, just for people to know, even if perhaps you can't actually change anything about that thing, because you did the best you could, you exhausted all options, but just so people know what to expect and how much time to give themselves to, you know, get around that thing. And I think the last thing I'll say is to read the wonderful work of disabled writers that are in collectives that have sort of talked about their organizing work, thinking specifically of care work. Not going to try to name all authors in this moment, but yeah, I think I've learned a lot from just reading from disabled authors in collectives and sort of talking about the messiness and the fumbles and the mistakes, and also people are allowed to make mistakes, and like being graceful in that as well. Like, it's a learning curve as we all learn our disabilities and what works for us. Like, people are also learning how to accommodate, even as other disabled people will mess up in trying to accommodate their fellow disabled people. So yeah, allowing mistakes and having grace there as well, but also calling in when things are not done the best way they can be. And then also to build on what Jennifer said around people feeling like a problem, like maybe having an anonymous, like, problematic box or form or something where people can be as problematic as they want to be, and you know, reminding people that it's not a problem for them to feel safe and accommodated and have a space where they can do so anonymously, because even if you can tell people that like they're not a problem, but the rest of the world does not affirm that, and so they may still feel that way. And so like giving them a space to do so anonymously can make them feel less like a problem and really affirm that for them.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to add?
I'm going to say continued collaboration between all the different, different conferences, different archival professional organizations. I mean, again, plugging SAA's guidelines or what's been written in Archival Outlook. And also making sure that you're not taking advantage of disabled free labor, I think, is a big and important thing. Quite often, you know, people will ask like, oh, you know, accommodations for this. Can I get your perspective on this? Can I do this? And they want all the solutions. But like, for example, I do archival accessible like workshops and things, right? But people want to come to me and then just take my advice and then just use that and just but not give credit where it needs to be due. And I think that's something you have to be very critical of, because exactly, pay your disabled accessibility consultants. Exactly. Because it's valuable work, it's necessary work, it's needed work, and unless we push for it, it's unfortunately sometimes unappreciated work.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. That was a really beautiful and validating and coalition building conclusion to this event. Yeah, I guess we are right up on time, but for folks who want to hear from some different authors of the chapters from the book, we'll be having another event on February 20th, and a lot of those focus on job advertisements, disabled labor, and retention. So hopefully continuing a lot of these threads. Yeah, I will just say an immense thank you to Michael, Alex, Zakiya, Jennifer, and Hilary for joining us today and sharing all of your powerful words. It's really lovely to hear you all talk about your chapters and extend the ideas. And I'll turn it over to Lydia for any final concluding remarks.
Yeah, I just want to add thank you. It's been really wonderful to be in community with everybody here and to generate all of these wonderful ideas. So thank you so much. Have a great day.